Nobody ever suspects the woman with warm eyes and a gentle voice. Elizabeth Bigley understood that early. She learned to smile in the mirror at age 10. By 15, she had forged her first letter. And by 20, she wasn't Elizabeth anymore. She was Miss Lydia DeVere, heiress to a sugar empire, sitting in a velvet chair in a Toronto bank, calmly withdrawing a $10,000 loan using documents that still smelled like wet ink. They handed her the money with a handshake and a smile. She never used violence, never lifted a weapon. Her hands remained soft, her skirts always pressed. But behind that calm exterior was a storm of names, forged checks, identities layered like old wallpaper, each lie covering another. By 25, she had opened accounts in 5 different cities, built fake investment schemes, married twice under false identities, and buried both marriages in forged death certificates. She told herself it was harmless, victimless. Banks insure themselves, she used to say, and those men, they wanted to be fooled. But one thing Elizabeth could never fake was sleep. At first, it was small things. She'd wake up at night and swear she'd heard someone calling her, a voice too close to her ear, the creak of a floorboard when no one was home, her silk curtains swaying as if touched. Then came the dreams. The first one was of a man she didn't recognize at first. He had wide eyes, bloodshot, begging. He said nothing, just stared. When she tried to move, she couldn't. The room got colder and colder until her breath misted in the air. Then he opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came. She woke up drenched in sweat, her nightgown soaked through. She wrote it off as stress. A bit of brandy helped, some lavender oil on her temples. But then she saw his face on the street the next day, not in real life, but on the front page of a newspaper blowing in the wind. Bank clerk dead by suicide after embezzlement charges. She had forged documents in his name, used his credentials. He had been fired, charged, humiliated. Now he was dead, and she had dreamed him before she knew. That was when things shifted. Something in her mind, some boundary, cracked. Sleep became dangerous. Closing her eyes was like stepping into courtrooms without lawyers, graves with open lids, banks flooded with blood. The dreams weren't just nightmares anymore. They were memories she didn't know she had, faces she never looked at closely when stealing from them, clerks, secretaries, old women cashing savings bonds. She saw them in her dreams, and then in the world, reflected in windows or behind her in mirrors, just for a second. Then, gone. She stopped sleeping deeply. She napped sitting up, afraid of sinking too far. Her skin grew pale. Her smiles became twitchy. Her forged letters grew sloppier. She began making mistakes, calling herself the wrong name, forgetting what alias she was using in which city. One night, in her grand rented estate in Buffalo, she sat in a bath of rose water and thought about drowning herself in it, just slipping under, letting it end. The lies, the pretending, the faces. But she didn't. Not yet. Instead, she wrapped herself in a towel, sat at her vanity, and saw a fingerprint, a smudge, on the mirror. She wiped it, but it didn't go away, because it wasn't on the glass. It was behind it. She stared at her own reflection and saw a face behind hers. A young boy, maybe 14, the age she was when she forged her first bank form. His eyes were glassy, accusing. He didn't move. But his presence was so real, it made her heart race like prey. She screamed and shattered the mirror with her brush. Glass rained down. Her maid came running. Elizabeth said nothing, just stood barefoot in the broken pieces, staring at her own bleeding toes. She told the maid to fetch her a new mirror. But it didn't matter. The faces weren't in the mirrors anymore. They were in her. Elizabeth didn't sleep for the next 2 nights. She tried. She really did. She took the laudanum. She steeped chamomile leaves in bone china cups. She soaked in lavender oil until her fingers shriveled like prunes. She even called a physician under the name Mrs. Eleanor Bixby, complaining of feminine nerves, and asked for sleeping powders. He prescribed her morphine drops, impressed by her poise and charmed by her fake British accent. But every time she tried to surrender herself to unconsciousness, something inside her fought back. as if her own body feared what her mind would find there. The mirror incident wasn't spoken of again, but the staff walked more carefully around her now. The housekeeper, Mrs. Dorr, no longer made small talk. The gardener avoided her eyes. Even the maid, sweet little Clara, with her trembling hands, started making excuses to stay out of the master bedroom past sundown, because they all heard her at night. Not screams, not exactly, but talking, muttering, rapid, anxious voices echoing from behind her door. Conversations that sounded one-sided, pacing, the soft thud of bare feet on the floor, furniture shifting, sometimes crying. Once, loud, choked laughter that made Mrs. Dorr clutch the rosary around her neck and whisper a prayer. But Elizabeth didn't remember the sounds, not fully. She remembered flashes, moments, waking up in odd places, at the foot of the bed, in her closet, once standing outside on the balcony with her hair soaked in rain and her gown clinging to her skin like a burial shroud. The worst moment came on the third night. She had sat by the fireplace in her sitting room with a ledger open, reviewing her notes for a new identity. This one was risky. She planned to pose as a widow named Henrietta Lowell, the daughter of a railroad magnate. The forgeries were coming along beautifully. The birth certificate had been aged with tea bags and fire smoke. The will was nearly perfect, but she couldn't concentrate. Her eyes blurred the ink. Her hand kept twitching. The ledger tilted sideways. The fire began to hiss louder than normal. She blinked hard, trying to shake the fog from her mind, but her whole body felt dipped in cold molasses, slow, heavy, sluggish. When her eyes fell shut, it wasn't gentle. It was like falling. The world snapped away. And then she was in a train station, not standing, sitting, her arms bound to a wooden bench by thick black rope. She looked around. The walls were rotting. The overhead lights blinked with electricity that sounded like bees caught in glass. There was no sound of trains, no people, just rows of benches, and every bench was full, not of passengers, of victims, dozens of faces, dirty, pale, weeping, motionless, some young, some old. Most wore cheap coats, ill-fitting hats. Their eyes were dull, but they were all staring at her, not speaking, not accusing, just looking. She tried to scream but found her mouth filled with paper, not cloth, paper. She clawed it out, spat it on the floor. The edges were crisp, faded. It was a check, her handwriting on it. One of her forgeries, another one followed, then another. Her mouth was stuffed with them, an endless supply, each one a memory of a lie. The more she spat, the more came. She turned her head and saw a man sitting beside her. His face was melted, like wax. No eyes, no nose, just a slit where a mouth should be. He leaned toward her, and when he spoke, the voice wasn't his. It was her own. "You said they deserved it." Elizabeth woke up screaming, her hands clawing at her face, her mouth dry and raw. The fire was out. The ledger was on the floor, but something was still in her mouth. She reached in, shaking, and pulled out a torn piece of parchment. Not real, surely not. But there it was, soaked from her spit and crumpled tight. A fake check with her forged signature on it. She dropped it and stumbled backward until she hit the wall, breathing hard, heart hammering like a piston. Her throat felt scorched. Her hands trembled so violently that she couldn't even light a candle. She sat in the corner like a frightened child until the dawn began to creep through the windows. That morning, Clara found her asleep on the floor, curled into herself like a broken marionette. Elizabeth didn't explain. She simply told the girl to draw her a bath and not to speak of the state she'd found her in. But something had changed now, something irreversible. She began to see faces in the daylight. It started in mirrors, always mirrors, but then began to move. The window of a passing carriage, a silver spoon, the shine of her shoe buckle, the face of an old man with cloudy eyes, a woman who used to work at a small post office, a child she'd bribed for a key. They were her victims, were people caught in the blast radius of her schemes, bit players in her elaborate cons. They looked at her like they knew what she was, not who she was. And the worst part, she began to forget their names. It disturbed her more than anything. She had always prided herself on her mind, her ability to catalog names, addresses, fake identities, signatures, mannerisms. But now the facts were slipping, like pages being ripped out one by one. Her perfect library of lies was burning from the inside. On the fourth night, she tried something different. She sat in her dressing room, dressed not in silk, but in an old nightgown she hadn't worn since her days living under her real name. The cotton was thin and stained at the collar. She lit a single oil lamp. No wine, no laudanum. Just silence. She faced the mirror, sat down, and whispered, "Who are you?" She didn't expect an answer, but the candle flickered, and the reflection behind her smiled. She jolted from the chair, spun around. Nothing, no one. The room was empty, but the candle still burned, and when she looked in the mirror again, her reflection was wrong. It blinked too slow. Elizabeth backed away from the glass, her hands trembling. She didn't scream this time. She didn't even cry. Instead, she laughed. A small, bitter laugh that cracked her lips, because somewhere deep inside, she knew she deserved this. All of it. The next morning, the postman delivered an envelope that didn't bear a stamp. It wasn't posted. It had been slipped under the door sometime before sunrise. Inside was a single piece of paper, typewritten. "You don't get to forget their names, we remember, and we're still waiting." There was no signature, no address, but the chill that crept up her spine was undeniable. Elizabeth folded the paper in half and tucked it into her corset. She said nothing, but that night, she didn't even try to sleep. She sat in a chair, facing the mirror, waiting. Elizabeth Bigley was no longer interested in wealth. It was a strange realization. She used to ache for it, to feel the weight of banknotes in her palm, to own jewelry so expensive it could silence any question about her origins. The rush of the con had been everything. The forged document accepted, the trusting handshake, the moment a man signed away a fortune thinking he was marrying an heiress when he was marrying a lie. But now, with her empire intact and untouched, with more aliases than real friends, Elizabeth no longer sought expansion. She sought escape. The faces, the dreams, the paper-chewed nightmares, they weren't going away. She hadn't slept in a bed in over a week. She kept dozing off in chairs, on the rug, by the fireplace, even once while seated at her desk, waking with her hand still gripping a fountain pen. Black ink spilled across her wrist like blood, and each time she drifted off, even for a second, they came back. The figures, silent, staring. Their eyes weren't violent. That was the worst part. They weren't threatening her. They were watching her unravel. On the morning of the 8th day, she found something new in the mirror. Not a face this time. A letter. It was sitting neatly on the vanity table behind her, visible only in the reflection. She turned slowly, and there it was. Pale blue envelope. No wax seal, just her name printed in black type. Elizabeth Bigley. Her real name. No Lydia DeVere, no Eleanor Bixby, no Henrietta Lowell. Just Elizabeth. A name she hadn't used in 5 years. Her hands shook as she picked it up. The envelope felt cold, not room temperature, cold like stone. Inside was a single sheet of thick cream paper. The message was typed like the last one, and short. You were warned not to forget. Someone's coming, not from your past, from your truth. There was no signature, no return address. She turned the paper over. Blank. She crumpled it without thinking, tossed it into the fireplace, and lit a match. It didn't burn. The paper blackened around the edges but refused to catch fully. The fire hissed and crackled, but the letter sat there, smoking, intact, unmoved, unburnable. Elizabeth didn't scream. She didn't flinch. She simply got up, walked calmly to her cabinet, took out a bottle of brandy, and poured herself a glass with hands that refused to stop trembling. That afternoon, her housekeeper, Mrs. Dorr, knocked gently on her study door and informed her that a man had arrived asking for her. He refused to leave his name, said he knew her from years ago. He was polite, but persistent. Elizabeth, wrapped in a silk robe with her hair a tangled mess, stared at the door for a long time before replying, "Send him in." She didn't ask who he was, because she already knew. The moment he stepped into the room, something in her bones locked up. He was tall, lean, about 40, though his sunken eyes and deep forehead lines made him look older. His hair was gray at the edges, a lifetime of disappointment threaded through each strand. He wore a dark wool coat, damp from the fog outside, and clutched a hat he didn't put down. "Elizabeth," he said softly, not with anger, not even surprise. Her throat dried. "Do I know you?" she asked, even though she already knew she was lying. He smiled a little. "Sadly, you married me," he said. His name was Thomas Granger, a farmer's son from Ohio. She had met him 5 years ago when she was posing as Beatrice Hensley, the niece of a railroad tycoon. He'd fallen fast. She had smiled, batted her lashes, and told him that she was tired of rich city men who only loved her for her dowry. He proposed after 6 weeks. She accepted. 2 weeks after that, she emptied his savings, forged a deed to his family land, and vanished. She thought he'd kill himself, honestly. He seemed fragile then, quiet, a little too trusting. Yet here he was, alive, hardened, and looking straight at her as if he'd been chasing her shadow across years. Elizabeth couldn't speak. Not at first. She just stood there, cold all over. He didn't yell, didn't lunge, didn't call the police or accuse her. He simply said, "I need you to sign something." She blinked. "Excuse me?" He reached into his coat and produced a folded legal document, set it on the desk. "It's a confession," he said. "Not notarized, not legal, just the truth. For me, for closure." She opened it, read the first few lines. It was a detailed account of what she'd done to him, what she'd taken, how she'd tricked his family, shamed his name, and stolen every penny his father had left behind. She read slowly, eyes moving across words like blades. At the bottom was a blank space waiting for her signature, and beneath that, 3 words written in pencil: "For the dead." Elizabeth looked up. He wasn't crying. He wasn't smiling. He was just there. "You think if I write my name, that'll undo it?" she asked bitterly. Thomas didn't answer right away. "No," he finally said, "but you'll stop dreaming about me." She laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was terrifying. "How do you know about the dreams?" He took a breath, stepped closer. His voice was soft now, kind. "I've had them too." Her blood went cold. He continued, "Ever since you disappeared. I kept seeing you, every night. Not you exactly, shadows of you. People calling your name, names, all your names. Sometimes I woke up with ink on my fingers. Once I dreamt of a child who cried until he bled from the eyes. He kept asking why the letters stopped coming. I don't even know who he was." He paused. "I wasn't the only one you destroyed, Elizabeth. I just might be the only one who survived." She looked at the paper. The confession. The ghost waiting at the end of a pen stroke. Something deep in her stomach twisted. "I don't want to forget what you did," he said, voice shaking now. "But I need you to admit it before the dreams become something worse." There was silence. The fire hissed in the hearth. Elizabeth lowered her eyes. "I can't," she whispered. He nodded, as if he expected that. "I'm staying in town for 2 nights," he said quietly. "If you change your mind." Then he turned and left. That night, Elizabeth didn't sleep. She sat with the paper in her lap, staring, waiting. The house felt wrong, too still. Every breath of wind outside sounded like a whisper through the walls. Around 3 a.m, the fire went out on its own. No wind, no draft. It just snuffed itself out, as if something unseen had breathed across the flame. And in the dark, she heard it. Footsteps. Not on the stairs, not down the hall, inside the room. She didn't move. Couldn't. The footsteps were slow, bare, wet-sounding, one after another, padding across the wooden floor like a child walking from the bath. Then, a voice. A whisper. Not loud, not angry. Just one word. "Sign." Elizabeth closed her eyes, hoping she was imagining it. But when she opened them, the confession was gone, and her name was written at the bottom in blood-red ink. Elizabeth didn't sleep. Again. But this time it wasn't fear that kept her awake. It was awareness. Something had changed in the air, as if the house had taken a breath and was now quietly holding it. The walls seemed tighter, the corners darker. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was expectant, waiting. She could feel it pressing against her skin like humidity, soaking into her hair, her lungs. The document Thomas had left, the false confession, was back on her desk. She knew she hadn't signed it. She remembered pacing the floor, staring at the blank space, nearly tearing it in half before throwing it across the room in rage. But when she woke that morning, it was sitting perfectly centered again. And this time, it had her signature. Written not in ink, in deep red with a faint metallic sheen that dried like old blood. She stared at it for a long time. Her first thought was, I'm losing my mind. Her second, or something else is writing in my name now. She didn't tell Thomas. She didn't know where he was staying, and she wasn't about to ask, not yet. The shame burned too hot in her chest. And even though a part of her longed to see him again, to confess for real, to finally release the weight she'd been dragging, a much colder part of her whispered that it was too late. Not just too late to say sorry, too late to be saved. That afternoon, Elizabeth dismissed the staff early. She told them she was traveling for a few days, though she didn't pack. Told Clara she needed solitude. Told Mrs. Dorr to lock the doors behind her and leave the key under the mat. They were used to her whims by now. They didn't ask questions. By sunset, the grand Victorian mansion was silent, emptied of human life, except for Elizabeth. She poured herself a glass of brandy and stood barefoot in the parlor, watching the fireplace she hadn't lit in 2 days. She didn't want heat anymore, didn't want comfort. She wanted answers. And if she couldn't get them from her past, she'd tear them from her present. The mirror above the fireplace reflected her silhouette, a frail woman wrapped in a silk dressing robe, her eyes hollow, her posture slouched like a widow awaiting bad news. She barely recognized herself. But it wasn't her reflection that made her drop the glass. It was the man standing behind her in the mirror. She turned instantly, heart slamming into her ribs, but there was no one there. Nothing. Just the faint smell of smoke. She looked back at the mirror. He was still there. A man in a black suit, face pale with sunken cheeks and lifeless eyes. His mouth hung slightly open. His eyes didn't blink. He wasn't moving. She backed away slowly, step by step, until her spine hit the opposite wall. The mirror still showed him, standing quietly where she had stood seconds ago. Except now, there was a faint red line around his neck. A collar, a scar, a rope burn. No, she thought, not again. She knew that face now. He was one of the investors she'd bled dry under the name Margaret Wilkes. He'd taken out a mortgage on his home, sold family heirlooms to buy into her fake telegraph expansion fund. She remembered thinking he was too easy, a dull man with dull eyes. He'd sent her letters after she vanished, begging letters. And then, one final note she never opened. Now, he was back, and he hadn't come alone. She stumbled backward into the hall, her bare feet slipping slightly on the waxed floorboards. Her breathing came fast and shallow, like she'd just run a mile in winter. She didn't look back at the mirror. Couldn't. Wouldn't. Because she knew if she saw him move, just a twitch, she'd start screaming and never stop. But the house wouldn't let her leave. The front door, locked, windows stuck. The back parlor door groaned like it had swollen shut in a storm, even though the weather outside was bone dry. She wasn't trapped by bricks or bolts. She was trapped by her past. The faces were no longer waiting for her to close her eyes. They had followed her into the waking world, slipping through reflections, echoing down stairwells, drifting through the wallpaper like mildew. And now they were beginning to speak. It started as whispers in the pipes, then the vents, then from behind the grandfather clock in the hall. Too soft to make out at first, then clearer. Names. She began to hear names. Clara Eves, the voice murmured. Jeffrey Whitmore. Anna Mill, 7 years old. Stolen bonds from her father's account. Elizabeth clutched her temples, sinking to the floor. No, she whispered. I don't remember them all. I didn't mean... Another voice interrupted her thoughts. A child's voice, clear and cold. You promised we'd be safe. She looked up sharply and saw a little girl standing at the end of the hallway, dressed in an old-fashioned frock, hair in braids, dirt smudged on her cheeks like she'd climbed out of a grave. Her eyes were glassy, dead, but watching. Watching Elizabeth the way only the dead can, without blinking, without fear, without time. Elizabeth scrambled to her feet, hands out. I didn't know your father gave everything. The child's head tilted. You lied. Her voice echoed, louder than her mouth moved. The walls seemed to bend with it. I was surviving, Elizabeth choked. I had nothing. I was a child, too. I was just trying to live. You were stealing lives, the girl said. And then she vanished, like fog in sunlight. Elizabeth ran, upstairs 2 steps at a time, nearly tripping over her own robe. She slammed her bedroom door shut and locked it behind her. For what? A locked door couldn't stop ghosts, couldn't stop her own mind, unraveling like thread pulled loose. She collapsed at the edge of her bed, pulling her knees to her chest. It wasn't a haunting. It was a reckoning. The confessions, the dreams, the faces, they weren't separate things. They were pieces of a puzzle she'd avoided her whole life. The cost of her survival, the weight of every lie, every forged document, every broken man and desperate widow who gave her their last coin thinking she was salvation. They weren't dead. They were just waiting. And now they were in her house. She remembered something Thomas said the day before. I've had the dreams too. What if she wasn't the only one? What if everyone she touched, everyone she wronged, carried a piece of her inside them, like rot inside an apple? What if her lies had infected the world around her, cursed it, like a disease that no one could diagnose? What if the dead weren't stuck? She was. Her eyes burned. Her skin crawled. She needed air. She stood, approached the window, and flung it open. The evening was still. Fog rolled slowly through the hedges. The streets were empty. But one thing was out of place. There was a man standing on the sidewalk across the street. Just standing, facing her window. She squinted, heart climbing higher. He didn't move, didn't wave, didn't blink. Even from a distance, she recognized the way his shoulders slumped. Another one, another victim, watching. She closed the window hard, drew the curtains, and stepped back. No one could help her now. Not the police, not priests, not Thomas. Because this wasn't about being caught. It was about being claimed. Elizabeth didn't move for a long time after closing the curtain. Her legs ached from tension, her palms were slick with sweat, and her robe clung to her back like damp paper. But she stood there in the silence, frozen, as if the house might swallow her whole if she dared to turn around. The man in the street hadn't moved. He was probably still there, silent and waiting, a faceless statue carved from shame and memory. And even if he wasn't, even if he was never real to begin with, someone had been there. And now, they knew she knew. A new thought emerged then, sharp as glass. What if I'm not hallucinating? What if someone is behind this? Someone alive? She had enemies, dozens, people she'd defrauded, people she'd ruined. Maybe not all of them died. Maybe not all of them drifted into suicide or poverty. Maybe some had waited, planned, set a trap. Her first instinct was to check her bedroom, then the hall, then the office. She moved quickly now, searching for signs of tampering, a disturbed rug, a cracked window, anything to prove someone had been inside. But nothing was touched. The rooms were pristine, cold, silent, too silent. Then she noticed the smell, faint but distinct. Cologne, not hers, not floral, not powdery, not soft like the scents she usually wore. It was musky, sharp, like cedar and smoke, masculine, familiar. She followed the scent into the hallway and down the stairs, heart hammering louder with each step. And then, just past the sitting room, in the shadow of the staircase, she found the black glove. One single leather glove, placed gently on the third step like an offering, clean, unworn, with a tiny silver button at the wrist. She didn't own it. She never had. Elizabeth stared at it for what felt like a year. Her breath came in shallow pulls now, like her lungs were afraid to fill. The glove was too perfect to be random, too deliberate. Someone had been inside, recently. And worse, they hadn't taken anything. They had left something behind. She picked up the glove with a handkerchief and brought it to the desk. It had no label, no initials. She unbuttoned the clasp carefully, searching the lining for any marking. Nothing. Then she paused. Underneath the glove, tucked between the folds, was a small card. She pulled it free. It was blank on one side. On the other, printed in elegant script, "We all learn to lie from someone." There was no signature, no date, just the sentence. Elizabeth nearly dropped it, but her fingers refused to let go. That sentence, that voice, it stirred something she hadn't touched in years, a memory of rain on a roof, of tobacco smoke and cold porridge, of a sharp-tongued woman with eyes like knives who once told a 10-year-old girl, "If you can fool a man, you can feed yourself for life." Her mother, dead now, or so Elizabeth had believed. The last she'd heard, the old woman had vanished from Canada after a string of petty frauds. Nothing serious, just tricks and seductions, small-town deception. But that handwriting, that smell, that glove, the timing was too perfect. Could she be alive? Could she be the one tormenting her now? Elizabeth dropped into her chair, the card still in her hand. All this time, she'd believed her madness was spiritual. Guilt, hallucinations, dreams. But what if someone was nudging her toward madness, amplifying it? The letters, the bloody signature, the locked doors, the whispered names. What if someone knew everything and was slowly unraveling her from the outside in? She thought of Thomas. Could he be involved? No. He didn't have the cruelty. He had sorrow in his voice, not vengeance. But her mother? That woman had taught her to forge before she learned to spell. Elizabeth had stolen her first dollar from a grocer's till under the guidance of that voice. We all learn to lie from someone. She dropped the card and stood abruptly. No more hiding. If this was a game, she would find the dealer. If it was revenge, she'd face it head on. She went to the library, unlocked a narrow drawer in the back of a shelf, and pulled out a slim wooden box lined with newspaper clippings, forged IDs, hand-sketched floor plans of banks, letters from old victims, and a sealed letter she had written to her mother 10 years ago, never mailed. She'd written it after her second big con, before she changed her name for good, before she disappeared forever. It simply read, "I won, Mother. You taught me well. I am you, only richer. Are you proud of me?" She had never sent it, but now she wondered if someone had found it anyway, if someone was answering, and if that someone wanted to finish what she started. The letter she never sent felt heavier than anything else in that box. Elizabeth held it between her fingers, staring at the fading ink, remembering how proud she was when she wrote it, how arrogant. She'd stood before a mirror back then, freshly dressed in stolen silk, diamonds glistening on her wrist, none of it hers, and told herself she had finally become more than the poor farm girl with a liar for a mother. Back then, the lies tasted sweet. Now they tasted like rot. She pressed the letter against her lips. "If you're alive," she whispered, "and you're behind this." She didn't finish, because if her mother was back, it wasn't for a reunion. It was for a reckoning. She spent the next day digging through names, newspapers, and aliases like a detective trying to solve her own murder. In her office beneath a floorboard, she kept an archive of forgeries, letters and clippings from every city she'd run from. She laid them out across the desk in neat rows, photos of banks she'd robbed with charm, men she'd married for inheritance, women she'd impersonated, trusts she'd broken, and among them, she found a folded telegram from 7 years ago. From M. Bigley, sent, Buffalo, NY to El Devere. Saw your name in the papers, thought you were smarter than that. Stop acting like you're the only Bigley who can forge. She'd dismissed it back then, thrown it into the drawer without a second thought. But now, the handwriting matched the card tucked inside the glove. That same confident curve, that sharp upward slash in the B, her mother. Margaret Bigley had never used her full name after fleeing Canada. She was a shadow who moved through border towns and mining camps, tricking miners out of gold shares, seducing widowers for pension accounts. A woman who taught Elizabeth how to wear grief like a dress and innocence like perfume. The last time they'd seen each other in person, Elizabeth was 16. Margaret had slapped her for forging a document with the wrong ink. "You don't win with kindness," she'd hissed. "You win by never blinking when you lie." Now, after all these years, the ghost of that voice was back in her ears. Elizabeth knew what she had to do. She changed her dress, brushed her hair, fixed her face, not because she wanted to look pretty, but because her mother would expect it. Weakness was always punished in the Bigley bloodline. By evening, Elizabeth sat alone in the drawing room, with a gas lamp lit low beside her, the letterbox open on her lap. She'd sent a telegram earlier that afternoon. Monsieur Bigley. From E. Bigley. You win. Let's finish this properly. I'll be waiting. Come home. She didn't know where it would land. She didn't even know if it would be read. But deep in her chest, she could feel it. Margaret already knew she'd send it. Because all of this, every hallucination, every ghost in the mirror, every bloody signature, had started after the confession arrived, the same time Thomas showed up, and the same time the letters started appearing. Elizabeth didn't believe in coincidences. She made a living exploiting them. Someone had orchestrated this, and that someone was finally coming for her crown. At precisely midnight, the house creaked. Not the usual stretch of wood or groan of beams, but a purposeful creak, like someone stepping carefully. Elizabeth was sitting upright in a velvet armchair near the fireplace, a poker in her hand, heart pounding. The flames danced shadows on the wall, and for a moment she thought she saw a figure move in the reflection of the piano. She stood, slow and steady. No footsteps followed. But then came a knock. Not at the front door, at the parlor window. 3 gentle taps, fingernails on glass. Elizabeth's spine stiffened. She turned, and there she was, Margaret Bigley, alive and smiling. Margaret Bigley stood outside the parlor window, her silhouette sharp against the fog, a black hat pinned over sleek silver hair, lips curled into a familiar smirk. Not a trace of age softened her, not her posture, not her stare. She looked like someone who'd never apologized for a single thing in her life. Elizabeth didn't move. The poker in her hand suddenly felt ridiculous, like a child's toy against the presence outside that glass. Margaret raised one gloved hand and tapped again, not impatiently. Just a reminder, I'm still here, and you invited me. Elizabeth forced herself to the window, unlatched it, and slowly pushed it open. The cold air hit her face like a slap. "Mother," she said. Margaret's smile deepened. "There's my clever girl." Elizabeth stepped aside. "Come in." She did, like she owned the place. Margaret crossed the threshold with calm precision, her heels tapping against the floorboards, her eyes darting around the room as if appraising it for flaws. She removed her gloves, then her coat, and dropped them onto a nearby chair without asking permission. "You redecorated," she said mildly. Elizabeth said nothing. Margaret tilted her head. "No drink? No. How have you been? I've come a long way. Have you been the one sending me the letters?" Margaret turned and looked her dead in the eyes. "Of course I have. No pretense, no lies. That was always her way. The truth, when it suited her, was just another form of power." "Why?" Elizabeth asked, her voice thin. Margaret walked slowly to the fireplace and extended her hands toward the flame, like a woman warming herself after a long journey. "You asked me to come. You said, 'Come home,' and here I am." Elizabeth's hands clenched. "That doesn't explain the dreams, the faces, the glove, the mirror." "Oh, sweetheart," Margaret said, her tone turning pitying. "That's not me." Elizabeth blinked. Margaret turned around fully now, eyes narrowing. "You think I gave you those nightmares? The guilt? The voices? That's your doing. I just turned the lights on." She walked back over and placed one finger on Elizabeth's chest. "All of it's already in here. I just helped you hear it louder." Elizabeth stepped back. Margaret chuckled softly. "You've built quite a reputation, haven't you? The great Miss Lydia de Vere, the brilliant Eleanor Bixby, all those men, all those banks." She clicked her tongue. "And yet you still can't sleep." "You made me this way," Elizabeth whispered. Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Did I? You taught me how to lie, how to forge, how to disappear." "Yes," Margaret said plainly. "And you were good at it, better than I ever was. You climbed higher than I did, stole more, lived finer." "Then why come back?" Margaret paused. Then, with slow, cold clarity, she said, "Because you forgot the first rule." Elizabeth stared. "What rule?" "Control the story, or the story controls you." Margaret leaned in close. "And you let it control you." They stood in silence. The fire crackled. The walls of the house creaked again. Or maybe it was just nerves, memory, the sound of things unraveling. Elizabeth didn't know what to say. She felt like she was staring into a warped mirror of her own future. Her mother wore guilt like perfume, faint, barely detectable, but clinging to every word. "You came to punish me," Elizabeth said quietly. "No," Margaret replied. "I came to wake you up." "To what?" "To the fact that you're slipping, that you've let the ghosts in, that you've gone soft. You're hiding in this house with your stolen money and dead names while the real world waits for you to come crawling back. They smell blood, Elizabeth, and once they know you're weak, they'll circle you like wolves." Elizabeth swallowed hard. Margaret sat down in the armchair across from her and crossed her legs with elegant composure. "They're coming," she said. "Not just the dreams, the people. You've left too many wounds open." "You make it sound like I have a choice," Elizabeth said bitterly. "You do," Margaret said. "Start lying again." Elizabeth stared. Margaret's voice dropped low, like a lullaby twisted into something sharper. "Put the mask back on, girl, or it won't be ghosts that take you down. It'll be the living." Elizabeth didn't answer. She sat stiff in her chair, her thoughts spinning like a rigged roulette wheel. Margaret made everything sound so simple, as if all Elizabeth had to do was stop feeling, stop remembering, put the mask back on, smile, sign, seduce, steal. But something was broken now, cracked deep inside her, too jagged to repair. And maybe it wasn't guilt or ghosts or madness. Maybe it was the slow realization that she wasn't untouchable anymore. And Margaret? Margaret had come not to save her, but to test her. Elizabeth rose from her chair, walked to the sideboard, and poured herself a drink. Her hands didn't shake this time. "You said they're coming," she said, her voice calm. "Do you mean the police? The victims?" Margaret smiled faintly. "You'll know them when they knock." Elizabeth turned to her, glass in hand. "And you? What happens now? You vanish again?" "I was never gone," Margaret replied. "You just stopped looking for me." They stared at each other, two versions of the same woman, one in silk and fear, the other in shadow and certainty. Elizabeth finally said, "You can stay the night if you want." Margaret rose. "I never sleep where I'm not in control." She walked toward the front door, and just before stepping into the fog, she looked back and added, "Lock your windows, girl. Not everything that climbs in wears a face you know." Then, she was gone. Elizabeth sat back down. The silence wrapped around her like old velvet, familiar, suffocating. She drank slowly, letting the burn anchor her to the moment. Maybe her mother was right. Maybe she was going soft. Maybe the old Elizabeth, the one who conned banks and ruined lives with nothing but a forged will and a well-cut dress, was still somewhere inside her. But if that was true, then who had been dreaming for her? Who had been whispering names in the dark? She turned to the fireplace, ready to toss the rest of her drink into the flames, and that's when she saw it. An envelope, lying on the hearth, right where Margaret had been standing. It hadn't been there before. Elizabeth knelt slowly and picked it up. The paper was damp with soot, faintly scorched along the edges. No seal, no name. Inside, a single slip of paper, typed. "You remember me now, don't you? You should. You forged my suicide note." Her blood went cold. The glass slipped from her hand and shattered on the floor. She didn't breathe. Couldn't, because that line wasn't just familiar. It was true. Years ago in St. Paul, she'd impersonated a grieving fiancé of a man named Simon Creel, a banker, kind, lonely, easy to manipulate. He'd discovered her fraud too late, threatened to expose her. So she forged a suicide letter in his hand, slipped it to the authorities, disappeared before the body was even pulled from the river. He was dead, and she had made the world believe he'd written his own end. Now, he was writing hers. Her knees gave out. She dropped to the rug, the note still clutched in her hand, trembling. It wasn't just the dead that were coming for her now. It was the lies, and they remembered everything. Elizabeth didn't sleep that night. She sat curled on the parlor rug, knees to her chest, staring into the dead fire with the scorched letter clutched in one hand and a broken whiskey glass beside her. Time had lost meaning. Shadows crawled across the walls like insects. The silence in the house was no longer quiet. It was loaded, like a question that hadn't been asked yet. The forged suicide note. Simon Creel. She remembered every word she'd written on that paper. "I was never enough for her. I failed her. I don't belong in this world." She had even practiced his handwriting for days, imitated the shape of his guilt, folded it just right, left it in his coat pocket before slipping out of his house at dawn. The story had worked. The authorities ruled it a suicide, but now someone, something, was reminding her that stories didn't die just because you buried them. At sunrise, she packed a travel bag, just the essentials: forged documents, emergency funds in 3 currencies, a new identity, Mrs. Sylvia Monroe, a fabricated widow from Maine with an inheritance case pending. The maid, Clara, would return in 2 days. The other staff weren't expected for a week. She didn't leave a note, didn't send a message. Elizabeth just walked out the back door and didn't look back. She took the early morning train to Albany. The car was half empty, quiet, perfect for disappearing. She sat in the last row, far from the few passengers muttering over their newspapers or dozing in their coats. She kept her hat low, her gloves tight, no jewelry, no signature perfume. She was no longer Elizabeth Bigley. She was nobody. The train rocked gently through the countryside. Outside, the trees were all bone thin and winter dead. Fog clung to the fields like mourning clothes. For a while, she almost convinced herself it was over, that she was escaping, that she could rebuild again. Then she heard it, a whisper, from the seat behind her, not loud, not even clear, just enough to turn her blood to ice. "Elizabeth," she froze. Her first thought, "They found me already." She turned her head slowly. The row behind her was empty. So was the one beyond that. The man across the aisle, an old farmer, half asleep with a wool blanket on his knees, hadn't moved. No one else had spoken, but she had heard it. Clear, familiar. Her name. Her real name. No one on that train should have known it. She moved to another car at the next stop, sat closer to the front this time, near the conductor's door. She watched everyone. The child playing with a wooden doll, the elderly woman knitting in the sunlight, the man in the gray coat reading a book upside down. That last one made her shiver. Because he wasn't just absent-minded. He kept glancing up at her, and when their eyes met, he mouthed something. "I know you." Elizabeth stood abruptly and left the car. In Albany, she checked into a boarding house under the name Mrs. Monroe. The place smelled of mildew and dust. The woman at the desk didn't ask for ID, just payment. Elizabeth took a room on the 3rd floor, small, spare, with a single window that overlooked an alley. The mirror in the corner was covered with a sheet. She left it that way. That night, she locked the door, bolted the window, slid the dresser in front of it, and tucked a kitchen knife under her pillow. She didn't sleep, but she did dream. Not of ghosts, not of Simon Creel. She dreamt of herself, staring into a mirror, but her reflection wouldn't mimic her. It just smiled and whispered, "Even your name won't hide you." Elizabeth awoke to the sound of knocking, but it wasn't at her door. It was inside the room. 3 slow, hollow knocks, wood on wood, like someone tapping gently against the wall from within. She sat up, the knife still clutched beneath her pillow, heart thudding so loud she could barely hear herself breathe. The room was gray with pre-dawn light. Fog pressed against the window like a damp cloth. The air inside smelled metallic, faintly sour. She rose slowly, her bare feet silent on the warped floorboards. The knocking came again, not on the wall, from the wardrobe. She stared at it. It was an old piece, warped oak with brass handles, tall enough to swallow her whole if it wanted to. She hadn't opened it the night before. She had no intention of unpacking. The sheet still draped over the mirror nearby shuddered slightly from her breath, or perhaps something else. Elizabeth gripped the knife tighter. 3 steps, 2, 1. She flung the wardrobe doors open. Nothing, just empty hangers and a faint scent of dust and mothballs. But then she looked down and saw a photograph, face down, yellowed, torn along the corner. She picked it up. The image showed a man, middle-aged, dark eyes, thin mustache. He stood stiff in front of a house she didn't recognize, but it was the handwriting on the back that stopped her breath. Don't believe what she tells you. She's lied before, about everything. No signature, but she recognized the penmanship. It was hers. She dropped the photo like it burned. There was no reason it should exist. She hadn't written that, not ever. Not about that man, whoever he was, unless someone was copying her. Or worse, someone was forging her lies now. The irony struck her bitter and deep. All her life, she'd lived by one rule: control the truth before someone else does. Now, someone was rewriting her history, twisting it into something she didn't recognize, using her style, her habits, her handwriting, and leaving it like a breadcrumb trail back to her own guilt. Someone was manipulating her the way she had once manipulated others. And whoever it was, they weren't doing it for money. They were doing it to break her. Later that morning, Elizabeth left the boarding house and walked aimlessly through the fog-soaked streets of Albany. She kept her collar up, her hat low, her steps slow. She didn't want to be followed. But it wasn't the law she feared. It was someone like her, someone trained to blend in, someone who knew how to study a person, how to wear faces, how to make others doubt what was real. She passed a bakery window and caught her reflection, pale, nervous, older than she remembered. Then she saw the man standing behind her, just for a moment. A flicker. When she turned, the street was empty. She ducked into a quiet cafe and took a corner seat, ordered tea with shaking fingers. Her eyes scanned every patron, a mother feeding her son porridge, a man reading a ledger, an older woman knitting. No one looked back. But then, the door opened and a woman stepped inside. Mid-40s, sharp eyes, dressed in black, gloves on, a folded newspaper in one hand. She didn't speak to the hostess. She didn't order. She just looked straight at Elizabeth, smiled, and laid a suicide note on the table beside her seat. Then she walked back out. Elizabeth couldn't move, couldn't speak. She waited 5 full minutes before approaching the table. The note was folded, yellowed, familiar. It was the same one she forged for Simon Creel. Only now it had been updated. At the bottom, in fresh ink, a final sentence had been added. This time, she'll be next. Elizabeth didn't open the note in the cafe. She folded it, tucked it beneath her coat, and left immediately, heart hammering, knees weak, palms burning from the sweat of sheer disbelief. She didn't look back, didn't ask questions, didn't confront the woman who had placed it on the table, because the woman was already gone. No one at the cafe remembered seeing her, not the barista. not the hostess. She had come in silently, left no trace, no order, no receipt, no footprints on the muddy floor near the door, like a ghost, or like someone who had practiced being invisible. Elizabeth returned to the boarding house and locked herself inside her room, drawing every curtain and wedging a chair beneath the doorknob. Then she sat on the edge of the bed and slowly unfolded the suicide note, the one she had forged years ago for Simon Creel. The handwriting was hers. The words were unchanged, except the new line at the bottom. This time, she'll be next. Her breath caught in her throat, not because of the message, but because the ink was still wet. It smeared slightly as her thumb brushed over it. The pen that wrote it had only lifted minutes ago, which meant whoever added it knew where she was. And more than that, and they were using her own tricks, the same kind of paper, the same typewriter, the same phrasing style, the same subtle bend in the loops of her E's. She was being hunted by someone who knew how she lied, not the victims, not ghosts. Someone who had studied her cons, her methods, her handwriting. Someone who was forging not just documents, but hauntings, and using the dead as tools. She pulled her bag onto the bed, dumped it out. Money, IDs, keys, passports. She flipped open one of her older aliases, Therese Chapman, a shipping heiress from Philadelphia. She scanned the birth certificate. There, just beneath the official seal, was a faint handwritten date she hadn't noticed before. It wasn't part of the forgery, it wasn't her handwriting, and it matched the day Simon Creel died. No one could have touched this file. It had been in her locked bag since New York. It was impossible, unless someone had planted it long before, as if they knew she'd eventually circle back to it, as if they were always 3 steps ahead. A knock, not on the door this time, on the window. She turned sharply. The curtains were drawn, but a faint silhouette loomed behind the thin fabric, unmoving, waiting. She stepped forward, blood roaring in her ears. "Who are you?" she whispered. Silence. Another knock. Then a whisper from beyond the glass. "You're not the only one who can fake a story." She yanked the curtain open. No one there, just a paper, pressed neatly against the outside of the glass by the breeze. She opened the window. It was another photo, old, blurred, a grave. The tombstone read, "Simon Creel, beloved son, beloved brother, forged twice." Elizabeth stared at the words. Forged twice? That's when it hit her. Whoever was doing this didn't want to kill her. They wanted to make her the next forgery. They weren't content with destroying her aliases. They were going to rewrite her entire story. The idea that someone could be forging her life, not just imitating her, but rewriting her into something else, burrowed so deeply into Elizabeth's brain that it made everything else blur. The tombstone photo, the wet ink, the haunting phrase on the window. You're not the only one who can fake a story. She wasn't dealing with a spirit, or justice, or guilt. She was dealing with someone like her. No, smarter, because this forger wasn't after money or revenge. They were after identity. And they'd already started cutting her out of her own life. She left the boarding house that morning with her travel bag, and no destination. Every corner of Albany felt infected, as if her presence had triggered some curse that now followed her like smoke. The fog clung to her coat. Her hat did nothing to disguise her anymore. She felt watched, not just followed, but observed, studied. She didn't know where to go, so she went where only someone like her would go, the public archives. It was tucked beside the county courthouse, quiet and gray, with iron railings and frosted windows. She told the clerk her name was Mrs. Sylvia Monroe and said she was researching estate records. The woman gave her a bored nod and waved her through. Inside, Elizabeth found herself surrounded by silence and paper, birth certificates, property deeds, marriage licenses, death reports, all cataloged, all real, or at least they used to be. She pulled her old aliases one by one, Lydia DeVere, Henrietta Lowell, Beatrice Hensley, and she found death certificates for each one, filed, stamped, dated. She stared at them, her breath going shallow. These weren't part of her cons. She'd never staged their deaths, never needed to. Those identities were meant to live on, stored in cities she never planned to visit again. But someone had filed official records in counties she hadn't even operated in, declaring them deceased. Each one had the same cause of death, suicide, all dated in the last 6 months. Elizabeth gripped the edge of the table to steady herself. She was being erased. One name at a time, someone was walking through the ruins of her life and planting official records to clean it all up, as if she'd never existed at all. She rushed to the front desk. "Who filed these?" The clerk raised an eyebrow. "Those are restricted case files. You'll need legal clearance to—" "I'm a widow," Elizabeth snapped. "That is my clearance." The woman recoiled, flustered. She handed her a form. Elizabeth scribbled a fake judge's name and slid it back with enough confidence to pass. The clerk sighed and turned to the record. "The filings were delivered by courier," she said. "Same name listed each time as point of contact." Elizabeth's eyes narrowed. "What name?" The clerk turned the paper toward her. "Margaret Bigley." She left the archives in a daze, the paper clutched in her hand. Her mother hadn't just returned. She was taking her back, piece by piece. At first, she thought the messages were warnings, some brutal motherly attempt at forcing her to face her guilt. But now she saw the truth. Margaret didn't want her daughter to repent. She wanted her replaced. She was using Elizabeth's own sins as a weapon, killing off her past identities, planting forged deaths, even leaving altered suicide notes. And worst of all, she wasn't doing it alone. That night, Elizabeth checked into a hotel under yet another alias, Grace Holloway, a name she hadn't used since forging art credentials for a Boston auction scam. She paid in cash, used a southern accent, and wore a new wig pulled tight beneath a cloche hat. She stayed awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. She thought about her mother's words. Control the story, or the story controls you. Margaret had spent a lifetime shaping lies. Now she was shaping Elizabeth's disappearance, not by killing her outright, but by writing her out of existence. And the world would believe it. Because who would question the death of a con woman who never existed? At 3:12 a.m., the hotel phone rang. Elizabeth jolted upright, heart racing. She stared at it, frozen. It rang again. She picked up slowly. "Hello?" Silence, then a whisper. "She's already written your ending." The line went dead. She left the hotel before dawn. This time, she wasn't running. She was chasing. She remembered something from the death records, a detail she hadn't noticed at first. Each fake death certificate had listed a witness to the body's discovery. Same name. Eleanor Crane. She didn't recognize it. Not one of her aliases, not a past mark. But if Margaret was orchestrating her erasure, Eleanor might be the one helping her do it. A hired forger? A shadow? An actress? Elizabeth didn't know, but she had a lead, and in her world, a lead was everything. She found Eleanor Crane in Utica, 2 towns east of Albany. The name appeared on a land lease, a rented cabin near the outskirts, tucked into old pine and misty hills, rural, isolated, the kind of place you'd go to write or rewrite. Elizabeth hired a driver, told him to wait at the edge of the road. "I'm meeting someone," she said. She didn't say she might not come back. The cabin was quiet. No smoke from the chimney, no light. She approached slowly, knife in her coat pocket, breath slow. The front door was unlocked. Inside, the walls were lined with typewriters, 6 of them, different models, different paper. Each one had a file next to it. Names, photographs, false histories, fabricated police reports. At the center of the room was a desk, and on it, a manuscript, titled The Final Life of Elizabeth Bigley. She opened it, typed on fresh paper, a full narrative, starting with her real name, her childhood, her crimes, her rise, her fall, her death, typed in the past tense. And on the final page, she vanished in shame, her body never found, her last words, "I was never real to begin with." Elizabeth stared at it, numb, but before she could speak, she heard a voice behind her, soft, calm, familiar. "Do you like it?" She turned, and there stood Eleanor Crane. Only, she wasn't Eleanor, she was Margaret Bigley, but not as she was weeks ago. She looked younger now, fresher, rebuilt, like Elizabeth had once looked years ago at the height of her fraud. Elizabeth stepped back. "You're not my mother," the woman smiled. "No, I'm your replacement." She stepped forward, gently placing a hand on the manuscript. "You taught the world how to lie, Elizabeth, but now it's my turn to teach them how you disappeared." Elizabeth's voice cracked. "You're not real." "Oh," the woman whispered, "but you're not either." She lifted a single match, struck it. The manuscript caught flame. Elizabeth lunged to stop her, but the woman vanished into smoke. As the pages burned, Elizabeth stood alone in the cabin, surrounded by a lifetime she didn't write, and a death she hadn't lived. And somewhere far away, another version of her was already taking her place. Smoke filled the cabin. Elizabeth stood frozen, eyes locked on the burning manuscript as it curled and blackened, the flames devouring page after page of a life that felt stolen, not by time, but by hands just like hers. Hands that forged, hands that rewrote. She didn't try to save it. The fire had taken too much already. Instead, she backed away, hand trembling at her side, the air thick with scorched paper and something else, something sweet and chemical, like ink melting off a lie. She stepped outside into the fog, but the world no longer felt like hers. For hours, she walked the town of Utica in a daze, every stranger's face suspect, every shadow on the street a possible twin. She passed windows and caught glimpses of her own reflection, but each time she wasn't sure it was really hers. The woman staring back looked like her, but colder, clearer, finished. It was as if the world had finally built a better version of her, and now wanted the original gone. By sundown, she found herself inside a narrow church at the edge of town. Not out of faith, out of habit. Churches offered sanctuary, or used to. She sat in the back pew, coat pulled tight around her, watching dust dance through shafts of amber light that spilled through stained glass windows. She had no plan anymore, no next move, no identity. Even her face wasn't hers alone now. What happens when someone starts living your life better than you did? The priest noticed her eventually. A man in his 60s with sunken eyes and a voice like cracked leather. He approached her slowly, hands clasped, not asking if she needed help, just waiting for her to speak. She didn't, but she must have looked broken because he eventually said, "Confession is free, even for those who don't believe in anything." She almost laughed. "I don't have a soul to confess," she whispered. "Good," he said. "That'll make it easier to clean." After she left the church, she walked to a public phone booth near the post office. There was one number she hadn't called since this started, one person who didn't just know her tricks, but knew the truth beneath them. Thomas. He was supposed to be gone, out of town. He had said he was only staying 2 nights, but when she dialed the hotel where he had first found her in Buffalo, the clerk said, "Yes, Mr. Granger is still here." Her throat tightened. "Can you patch me through?" Moments passed. Then a familiar voice. "Hello?" She hesitated. "It's me." A pause, then a low breath. "I didn't think I'd hear from you again." "Something's happened," she said. "I know," he said, cutting her off. "You're not the only one being followed." They met in a train station that night, a halfway point between Utica and Buffalo. He looked worse than before, hollow-eyed, nervous, but not broken. He sat down beside her on the platform bench without a word. For a few minutes, they just watched the tracks stretch into the dark. Then he said, "I saw her." Elizabeth stiffened. "Who?" "The woman who looks like you." Her skin went cold. She came to my hotel room 3 nights ago, he said. I thought it was you. She even used your voice, but then she smiled, and I knew. He shivered. She has your face, but it's empty, like someone carved it out and left only the performance. Elizabeth stared at him. What did she say? That you were dead, he said, and that she was finally here to fix your mistakes. Elizabeth gripped the edge of the bench. Why you? She asked. She said I was your weakness, that your guilt was an infection, that it needed to be cleaned. She used that word with me too, Elizabeth muttered. Cleansed, rewritten. Thomas nodded. She said she's been watching you, following your work, collecting it, that you were the prototype, and she's the perfected draft. Elizabeth let out a shaky breath. A prototype. That's all she was now. Someone else had refined the lie she built for herself and made it so convincing, even the people who knew her couldn't tell the difference. How do we stop her? She asked. Thomas shook his head. I don't think she's just a person, he said. She's more like a story that learned how to write itself. They left the station together, walking through the fog-slicked streets toward a rented car. Elizabeth explained what she'd seen in the cabin, the typewriters, the manuscript, the death certificates. Thomas listened, silent but alert. Then she said, It wasn't just her. My mother was involved. Thomas stopped walking. Your mother's dead. Elizabeth looked at him. No, she said. She's not. She's helping her. Helping who? Elizabeth hesitated. Me. Or what used to be her. Or what came after. They drove for hours through back roads, avoiding cities, avoiding names. Elizabeth scribbled notes across her lap, names of aliases, dates, towns, every place she'd used or discarded an identity. Then, she circled the ones where she found fake death records. Everywhere she files a fake death, she muttered, she reappears shortly after under that identity, reanimated. She doesn't just erase me, she becomes me. Thomas looked at her. You think she's collecting your life like a costume? No, Elizabeth said, eyes sharp. She's wearing it better than I ever did. By morning, they reached an old farmhouse on the edge of Syracuse. It had belonged to one of Elizabeth's earliest aliases, Marion Cole, an identity she had used to rent a property under a fake inheritance story. The place had been abandoned for years, or so she thought. Inside, the rooms were clean. There were lit candles on the table. A mirror in the hallway was freshly polished, and on the mantel above the fireplace was a photograph of her. But it wasn't her. It was the other woman, the one from the cabin, Eleanor Crane. The same face, the same hair, but the smile was softer, sadder, more real than Elizabeth remembered ever looking. She's already moved in, Elizabeth whispered. She's already living it, Thomas said. They found another note in the kitchen, scrawled in crimson ink across a ledger Elizabeth once used to track her forgeries. A lie doesn't have to die. It just has to evolve. That night, they didn't speak. They sat across from each other at the kitchen table, candles burning between them, a silence hanging that was too thick for words. Elizabeth stared at the flame, wondering how long she had left before the world stopped recognizing her entirely. She reached for Thomas's hand. He didn't pull away. But somewhere outside, beneath the trees, the other her was watching and waiting. Elizabeth didn't sleep that night. She sat at the window of the farmhouse in Marion Cole's name, watching the mist roll across the empty fields like a living thing. Her hand gripped the back of the chair tightly, knuckles bone white. Inside her chest, a cold certainty had begun to settle. She couldn't keep running. She had spent her life surviving, through charm, wit, forged names, fake tears. She lied better than anyone she knew. She created identities so convincing that banks' men, even judges, had sworn by them. But now someone else was playing her game, and they were winning. Whoever this other Elizabeth was, this Eleanor Crane, this face thief, this author of her unraveling, she wasn't just mimicking Elizabeth's life. She was replacing it. becoming it. Filing death notices, appearing in the cities Elizabeth once escaped, taking over her aliases with a kind of eerie perfection. Not a woman, but a walking, breathing correction. And if Elizabeth didn't stop her now, she would be reduced to a myth, a story with too many versions to trace, a memory with no original, a forgery of herself. Thomas woke just before sunrise and found her in the same spot, unmoved. "You didn't sleep." Elizabeth shook her head slowly. "I can't afford to sleep anymore." He poured 2 cups of coffee, no cream, no sugar, bitter as truth. "She's getting bolder," he said. "It used to be mirrors, notes, glimpses. Now she's leaving full manuscripts in cabins, photographs in your homes." Elizabeth took a long sip before replying. "She wants to be found." Thomas looked confused. "Why would she want that?" "Because it completes the story. What's a final draft without an ending?" He frowned. "So what do you do?" She stood slowly and pulled on her coat. "I give her one." The plan was simple. If this imposter was feeding off Elizabeth's life, her names, her crimes, her footprints, then she would bait her into confrontation by doing the one thing she never did: tell the truth, not to the police, not to the papers, but to the world that had once praised her, feared her, hunted her, and ultimately forgotten her. She would claim her real name again. And she would do it publicly. The next day, they drove to New York City, a place Elizabeth had avoided for years. Too many witnesses, too many layers of records, too many people who knew the name Elizabeth Bigley before she ever became Lydia or Beatrice or Eleanor. She walked into the editorial offices of the Herald Tribune, wearing no disguise, no alias. She approached the editor-in-chief herself, a tall, iron-haired man with a voice like a gavel, and laid down a letter on his desk. A confession, every con, every fraud, every false name she ever used, the identities she stole, the banks she manipulated, the men she married and abandoned, the suicide notes she wrote for people who never wanted to die. Signed at the bottom, Elizabeth Bigley. "Print it," she said. The editor narrowed his eyes. "This real?" "You'll know it is," she said, "because the woman who answers it won't be me." The article hit front pages the next morning. "Confessions of a Ghost, the real Elizabeth Bigley speaks." Within hours, her name was back in circulation. The radio picked it up. Telegrams buzzed. Lawyers and detectives came sniffing like hounds. But none of them knew what to do with her, because every identity she confessed had already been declared dead, officially, legally, perfectly filed by someone else. Still, the story sparked fire, and it worked, because by nightfall she received a telegram. No sender, no return address, just one sentence. "You want to meet the lie? Then come see what you left behind." And an address in Philadelphia. Elizabeth and Thomas arrived just after midnight. The house was a townhouse, old brick, black shutters, ivy climbing the walls like veins. She recognized it. She had once used it under the name Margaret Elise Dighton, a fake literary historian who conned a small museum out of rare manuscripts by claiming her family had owned them since the 1600s. It had been one of her cleanest escapes. Until now. The front door was unlocked. She stepped inside. The walls were covered in her handwriting. Not notes, not stories. Letters, hundreds, thousands, pinned and taped and pasted. Letters Elizabeth had never written, but all of them addressed to people she had once deceived. To Simon Creel, to Thomas, to a widow named Mrs. Lawton, a pastor, a schoolteacher, all apologies, all confessions, all lies, written in her hand, in her voice, but not by her. They weren't fakes, they were corrections. The imposter wasn't just rewriting Elizabeth's history, she was healing it, cleansing it, finishing it. In the center of the room was a large oval mirror, and in it stood the woman, wearing Elizabeth's face, hair tied back, a soft, melancholy smile, paler, colder, but unmistakable. Elizabeth stared at her reflection, but it didn't move. It smiled instead and said, "Welcome home." Elizabeth stepped forward. Who are you? The woman in the mirror tilted her head. I'm who you were trying to be. No, Elizabeth snapped. You're a fraud, a parasite. The woman chuckled softly. No, I'm the editor. You were the first draft. Crude, unpolished, chaotic. I'm the one they'll remember, because I'm the one who ends the story properly. She reached out, palm pressed to the glass. History forgets the sinner. It remembers the confession. Elizabeth shook her head slowly. You can't fix what I did. The woman's smile widened. I already have. Elizabeth turned to Thomas, but he wasn't looking at her anymore. He was staring at the mirror, his face pale, his mouth slightly open, because what he saw in the reflection wasn't Elizabeth. It was her, the imposter, standing beside him, holding his hand. He backed away. Elizabeth turned to the real space beside her, empty. When she looked back to the mirror, her own reflection was gone. The woman in the mirror leaned forward and whispered, To kill a lie, you must name it. But you've used too many. So now I'll name you. Forgotten. And the mirror shattered. Glass sprayed across the room. Elizabeth shielded her face, staggering backward. When she looked up again, the room was empty. No woman, no letters, no mirror. Only her and Thomas, alone, again. But this time, Elizabeth wasn't sure who she was anymore, or if anyone, anywhere, could still prove it. Elizabeth sat in silence as Thomas drove through the dark streets of Philadelphia. Neither of them spoke, not since the mirror shattered, not since the imposter vanished like smoke. Her palms were still nicked from the glass. Thin red lines marked the story across her skin. Blood for punctuation, proof she was still here, still real. Maybe. Thomas glanced at her, but his face was unreadable. What did you see? She asked finally. Her voice cracked from hours of silence. He hesitated. You. No, not me. She looked at him. Her. Thomas tightened his grip on the steering wheel. She looked like you. She sounded like you, but? She made me believe she could be better than you. Elizabeth turned her face toward the window. The city lights smeared across the glass like tears. That was the part that hurt the most. Not that someone had stolen her face, not even that they were stealing her past, but that they were doing it more convincingly than she ever had. They checked into a nameless motel off the highway, peeling paint, buzzing lights, a place no one looked twice at. Elizabeth sat on the edge of the bed, staring at her own reflection in a cracked mirror. I don't think I'm the original, she said quietly. Thomas looked up from the chair in the corner. What do you mean? I think she's always been there, in the background, watching, waiting. She knows things I've forgotten. She's filed documents I never touched. She writes in my hand. Sometimes I wonder, she stopped. Wonder what? If I ever really existed to begin with. Thomas stood, walked over, sat beside her. You existed. You ruined me. I remember every second. A bitter smile tugged at her lips. Not exactly a glowing review. It means you were real enough to hurt, he said. Elizabeth let that sink in, then whispered, I need to find the last name. Thomas blinked. Oh, what? I've used dozens of identities, stolen hundreds, forged maybe 1,000, but there's only one I never touched, never forged, never ran from. She looked at him, eyes wide now. My birth name. Thomas was quiet. I buried it, she said, on purpose, because it was worthless, because it was tied to my mother, and to poverty, and to shame. I thought becoming someone else would erase it. But you think it's the only thing that can stop her, he said. She nodded. If she's become all of my fakes, then the only way to beat her is to become the one version of myself she can't counterfeit. Thomas swallowed hard. Then what is it? Elizabeth stood, walked to her bag, pulled out an old fraying envelope. Inside, a birth certificate, one she had hidden for over 15 years. Name, Eliza Margaret Wilkins. Date of birth, July 6, 1868. Mother, Margaret Wilkins, unmarried. Thomas read it twice. You've been using Elizabeth Bigley for so long, I forgot it wasn't real, he said. Elizabeth nodded. I stole Bigley from a cousin who ran off to Toronto. She owed money. It was the first name I ever tried on. I liked how it sounded. She ran a hand through her hair. But this is mine. The last name I haven't corrupted. Thomas looked at her. Then what do you do with it? She took a deep breath. I resurrect it. The next morning, she walked into the Philadelphia Bureau of Records, dressed plainly, hair tied back, no jewelry, no accent. She carried the original birth certificate in one hand, and nothing else. When the clerk at the desk asked, "How can I help you?" Elizabeth said, "I'm here to reclaim my name." It took hours, papers, verifications, a visit to a dusty back office where a tired man with wire-rimmed glasses scanned the certificate 3 times before finally nodding. "This hasn't been altered," he said. "It's real," Elizabeth replied. He looked up. "Not many people come in here trying to become themselves again." She said nothing. By afternoon, it was official. She held the document in her hand, warm from the machine. Name restored, Eliza Margaret Wilkins. Not an alias, not a mask, not a lie. Just a quiet truth she had once discarded like trash, now burning in her hand like a torch. When she returned to the motel, Thomas was waiting with a newspaper. The front page headline read, "Elizabeth Bigley found dead in Hudson River, confirmed by dental records." She stopped breathing. "They've killed you," he said softly. "Or her, or whatever she is." Elizabeth stared at the paper. The face printed beside the headline was hers, but she hadn't died. She was holding the proof in her hands. She was still here. "I knew she'd do it," Elizabeth said. "Kill the last version of me. Close the loop." Thomas looked at her. "Then who are you now?" She looked up at him, her voice steady. "Eliza." That night, they burned every alias she had ever used, every passport, every forged certificate, every fake marriage license. All of it, gone in the motel sink, lit match after match, until the smoke alarm finally screamed. They left before the manager could pound on the door. 2 days later, Eliza stood in the city library and wrote a letter by hand. Not forged, not manipulated, just honest. It was short. "You've taken everything I built, all the lies, all the names, but you can't have this one, because this one is mine. If you want it, come take it." She signed it, Eliza Margaret Wilkins. Then she mailed it to the same return address used in the death notices. To Eleanor Crane. 3 days later, a letter arrived at her motel. No envelope, just a folded paper slipped under the door. Inside, "You've finally said your name, now come bury it." An address, Buffalo, New York. That night, Eliza packed her bag. She kissed Thomas once, softly. "If I don't come back," he stopped her. "You'll come back." She looked him in the eyes. "Not as who you remember." He didn't argue, because he already knew. The lie had to die, so the truth could survive. The bus to Buffalo rattled like an old lung. Eliza sat near the back, coat wrapped tight, hair pulled back, her birth certificate folded neatly inside the pocket over her heart. Not forged, not edited, just paper and ink and truth, worn by time and nearly forgotten by everyone, herself included. It had taken over a decade to return to the place she'd once escaped. The town where she'd been born, Eliza Margaret Wilkins, an illegitimate daughter to a woman who taught her that honesty was a luxury only fools clung to. The last time she'd stood on that dirt, she was 16, with a forged train ticket in one hand and someone else's name in the other. Now she was returning with no name but her own. And something was waiting for her. Something, or someone, who had already written her ending. Buffalo hadn't changed much. Still gray, still cold, still the kind of place that swallowed its poor and blamed them for starving. The air smelled like rust and ash. The same factories coughed soot into the sky. The streets still hummed with a strange silence, like they were holding secrets beneath the ice. Eliza stepped off the bus with nothing but her bag and her past. The address from the note led her to the edge of town, a broken 2-story house behind a row of abandoned grain silos. The same house she grew up in. Only now it was rotting. The porch sagged. The windows were boarded with nails that looked hammered in anger. The front door was painted the same pale blue from her childhood, but now the paint peeled like sunburnt skin. She stood in front of it for a long time. Memories didn't knock, they burst in. The taste of lye soap, the sound of newspaper rustling, her mother's sharp voice slicing through morning silence. Smile when you lie, Eliza. Always smile. She climbed the porch steps slowly. The door was unlocked. Inside, the house was dark, cold, and too quiet. She stepped in and closed the door behind her. The smell hit her first. Old tobacco, cheap whiskey, and something else. Something faintly sweet and chemical, like rotting perfume. The parlor looked untouched since she left. Same wallpaper, same crooked portrait of a man who never existed. Her father, made up to convince a boarding school once. But now there were new things. Letters, dozens of them, all written in her own hand. Some genuine, some not. Some real confessions, some rewrites. Some she'd never seen before, yet recognized all the same, because the voice in them was almost hers. Then came the sound. A chair creaking upstairs. She followed it, one step at a time. The second floor was darker. A long hallway stretched ahead, lined with photographs she didn't remember. Snapshots of her aliases, Beatrice, Lydia, Marion. Each one had been framed, labeled, and hung on the wall like trophies. At the end of the hall, a single door was open. Inside, the only light came from a single oil lamp. And sitting by the window, in a chair with a cigarette burning low between two fingers, was Margaret Wilkins, her mother. "About time," she said, voice rough as gravel. Eliza stepped inside. Margaret looked older, but not weaker. Her body was thinner, her hands more bone than flesh, but her eyes still cut like razors, steel blue and unforgiving. "You're alive," Eliza said. Margaret blew smoke toward the ceiling. "Hard to die when you're already a ghost." Eliza didn't sit. "I saw your death certificate," she said. Margaret grinned. "Filed it myself." "Why?" "So you'd stop looking for me. You sent the letters." "I only sent the first one," Margaret said. The rest came from her. Eliza's breath caught. "She's here?" Margaret nodded toward the mirror beside the vanity. "You already know that." Eliza turned, and there she was, the other her, the imposter, dressed in black, standing perfectly still, not a reflection, not a ghost, a woman, flesh and blood. Eliza took a step back. "Who are you?" The woman smiled, her smile. "I'm your ending," she said. Margaret exhaled a lazy puff of smoke. "Told her everything, you know. Taught her the scripts, the lies, the truths beneath them." Eliza's voice was low, cold. "She's not me." "No," Margaret said. "She's better." Eliza turned sharply. "You made me," Margaret shrugged, "and I fixed you. I'm not broken." "You were the first lie I ever told," Margaret said flatly. "The unmarried mother with a miracle daughter? Please. You were leverage, nothing more." Eliza's face went still, and the imposter, the woman in the mirror, stepped forward. "Your mother gave me your story," she said, "but I gave it an ending." Eliza clenched her fists. "You're not real," the woman smiled. "Neither were you." Silence. Then Margaret stood. "I taught you how to disappear, Eliza, but I never taught you how to end. That's what you lacked. That's what she has." Eliza looked between them. Her hands were shaking now, but she didn't move. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered. The imposter stepped closer. "Because you left a story half-written. You vanished into aliases. You became nothing. Now I'm finishing it. You want me dead." I want you gone, she said. The world will remember Elizabeth Bigley as the woman who confessed, paid her debts, and died with dignity, not the coward who ran. I never ran, Eliza hissed. Yes, you did, Margaret said. You ran from yourself. Eliza pulled the birth certificate from her coat pocket and threw it at her mother's feet. This is who I am. The impostor picked it up, read it, smiled. Too late. She pulled a folded sheet of paper from her coat. A fresh death certificate, Eliza Margaret Wilkins, deceased, filed, stamped, official. You died yesterday, she said softly. Found in a river, overdose, just like the others. Eliza took a step back. No one's coming for you, the impostor whispered, because the world already believes I'm you, and you're a mistake. Margaret nodded once. It's cleaner this way. Eliza stared at both of them, then laughed. Not because it was funny, but because she understood. You don't want to kill me, she said. No? No, Eliza said, stepping forward. You need me. Without me, you don't exist. You're not a real person. You're my shadow. You're the closing line of a sentence I wrote. The impostor's smile twitched. Margaret lit another cigarette. Careful, girl. Pride's what killed the last version of you. Eliza stared at her mother, the woman who taught her to lie. You're wrong, she said. I didn't run from myself. She looked back at the impostor. I ran from you. And then she turned, walked to the mirror, and slammed her fist into it. The glass cracked, not shattered, but deep. A line ran from top to bottom, splitting the reflection in half. The impostor staggered back, clutching her face. A thin line of blood ran down her cheek. Eliza breathed hard. Only I get to finish my story. Margaret didn't speak. Neither did the woman. Eliza stepped toward the door. Burn the certificates, burn the lies, but you'll never erase me. She left the house, didn't run, didn't cry. Behind her, the house stood in silence, as if, for the first time in years, it didn't know what story it was telling anymore. Eliza didn't return to the motel. She didn't call Thomas. She didn't even look back at the house where her mother had sat, puffing cigarette smoke into the rotting walls, proudly watching a copy replace her daughter like a suit changed before a party. She just walked, through the streets of Buffalo, through the fog of memory, through the ashes of a dozen selves that now seemed like costumes abandoned after a bad show. For the first time in years, she had no name on her lips, no alias to shield her, no lie to hold in her mouth like a weapon. The truth was all she had now, and it was a thin, cold thing, barely strong enough to hold her upright. She reached a crossroads just before dawn, hands shoved into her coat, eyes swollen from exhaustion, shoes muddy from back alleys. A chapel stood nearby, dilapidated. Its steeple cracked, its sign faded, letters missing. But Eliza remembered it. This was where she'd stood when she forged her first identity. 15 years old. A church baptism forged on stained stationery, claiming to be someone else's daughter, given a second chance by God's hand in a dead man's name. It had started here, so maybe it needed to end here. She pushed open the warped chapel door. The hinges groaned like a beast disturbed. The pews were empty. The altar bare. Dust hung in the air like suspended time, and behind the pulpit was a faded wall of paper, prayers, confessions, names scrawled and pinned by those who came seeking forgiveness. Eliza stared at it for a long moment, then approached. She dug into her coat pocket and pulled out what little she still carried, the scorched birth certificate, half burned at the edge from the fireplace she and Thomas had used, the rest of it intact. She pinned it to the wall, and beneath it, she wrote in her own hand. This is who I was before the lies. This is the name I never killed. This is the truth that survived. She stepped back. It didn't make her feel cleaner. It didn't redeem anything. But it made her seen, not remembered, not forgiven, just real. She was about to leave when she heard the door creak open behind her. She turned quickly, breath caught. But it wasn't the imposter. It wasn't her mother. It was a young woman, early 20s, slender, freckled skin, big, anxious eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She wore a nurse's coat, stained and wrinkled, like she'd just gotten off a long shift she hadn't wanted to do. They locked eyes. The woman froze. "Are you—" Eliza straightened. "Who are you?" The girl stepped forward cautiously. "My name's Nora." "Nora who?" She hesitated. "Nora Bigley." Eliza's blood went cold. The name hung in the air like a curse. Bigley. That name again. The one she'd stolen. The one that started everything. But this wasn't a copycat. Nora wasn't a reflection. She was real, alive, breathing. And she meant something. Eliza's voice shook. "Who are your parents?" Nora swallowed. "I don't know my father, never met him. My mother said she wasn't sure." Eliza stared at her. "Your mother's name?" "Marion Cole." Eliza stumbled backward. That was one of her aliases. Marion Cole, a fake identity she'd used years ago in a small-town con where she posed as a grieving widow to collect sympathy donations in real estate. She'd only stayed 3 months, met a man, took his money, left without a word. She hadn't even remembered his name. And now, that con had grown up, into a person, into a daughter. "No," Eliza said, voice cracking. "That's not possible." "I think it is," Nora whispered. She stepped forward, reaching into her pocket, pulled out a torn photograph. It showed a younger version of Eliza, smiling, wearing a red shawl, standing beside a man at a farm gate. She didn't remember the picture, didn't remember being seen, didn't remember being kept. "My mom kept this her whole life," Nora said. "She told me you were someone she'd never forget. She said you left, but that you'd come back one day. She never said your real name, just whispered Eliza sometimes when she thought I wasn't listening." Eliza covered her mouth. Her knees gave out. She sat in the pew, shaking. Nora sat beside her, quiet. "I thought you might be a ghost," Nora said after a while. "You match the description. Some say you died. Some say you faked everything. Some say you were never real at all." Eliza laughed bitterly. "That last one's not far off." "I don't care," Nora said. "I just wanted to see your face." "Why now?" "Because someone else came looking first," Nora whispered. Eliza turned to her, pulse racing. "Who?" "A woman. Looked just like you, colder. She asked for records. She was angry, like she was cleaning something up." Eliza swallowed hard. "She's trying to erase me from your story." "I didn't tell her anything," Nora said, "but she left something." She handed Eliza a folded slip of paper. On it, typed in red ink, "You can rewrite the past all you want, but the future already belongs to me." And below that, property transfer scheduled, Marion Cole Estate to Eleanor Crane. She was stealing her aliases, one by one, buying the homes, claiming the deeds, planting herself in the past so thoroughly that even Eliza's mistakes would no longer be hers. "I need to go back," Eliza said. "Back where?" "Where I left her." She returned to Buffalo that night, not to confront her mother, not to fight the imposter, but to find the last witness to her truth, Thomas. When she arrived at the motel, the door to their room was open, the lamp was on, the bed untouched, and on the table was a note. "I know who she is now. I went to end it myself. Don't follow me." It was signed, Thomas Granger. Eliza stared at the note, and for the first time in this entire nightmare, she felt true fear, because she knew exactly what he was walking into, and this time, she wasn't sure he'd come out. Eliza didn't stop for breath, didn't stop to pack, to eat, to think. Thomas was gone. The note left behind in the motel room was short, final, and dangerous. "I know who she is now. I went to end it myself. Don't follow me." But he should have known better. She had spent a lifetime chasing what didn't want to be found. He was no exception. The trail led her to a town called Castor's Hollow. Quiet, tucked between hills, the kind of place where stories died in basements and rumors lived longer than people. It was the last town she'd used the alias Margaret Elise Dayton, and the same town where the imposter had filed a transfer of property days ago. One of her old names, one of her old homes, one of her final shadows. By the time Eliza arrived, the sun was down, and the fog had rolled in thick and low, curling around street lamps and windows like smoke from a slow hidden fire. She found the house quickly. It had been repainted, the porch repaired. A new brass nameplate on the mailbox, E. Crane. She approached the door, heart hammering, fingers ready to knock, when she heard it. A voice, Thomas's voice, inside, shouting. She pushed the door open without knocking. The hallway stretched long and dim, lit by a single flickering bulb. The walls were lined with pages, confessions, forgeries, letters, her life, dissected, rewritten, pinned up like exhibits in a museum of guilt. And at the end of the hallway, she saw them. Thomas and her, the woman with her face. But something was different. Thomas wasn't confronting her. He was standing beside her, and he was holding a notebook, open, reading from it. Her voice froze in her throat. His words were soft, precise, like he'd rehearsed them. And so the lie ends not with a bullet, not with a flame, but with silence, and the knowing that the story never needed her at all. He looked up. So did the imposter. Both of them saw her. Neither looked surprised. "Eliza," Thomas said calmly, "you came." She stepped forward slowly. The walls felt like they were folding in. "What are you doing?" she asked. "I'm finishing it," he said. The imposter smiled. "We needed your voice to fade first." Eliza's eyes darted to the notebook. "What is that?" Thomas didn't blink. "Your story." "No, that's mine. You can't." He held up a hand. "Eliza, none of this was ever just yours." Her legs weakened. The room tilted. Thomas had been with her since the unraveling began. He had followed her across states, watched her weep, slept in her bed. He had believed her, and now he was rewriting her. "You told me you wanted justice," she whispered. "I did," he said, "and you're getting it, but not the way you imagined." The imposter stepped closer, her movements perfect, too perfect. "You inspired this," she said. "Every lie you told, every name you wore, you created such a delicious mess. But stories like yours, they're better when told by someone else." Eliza's hands curled into fists. "You're not me." "No," the woman said. "I'm who they'll remember," Thomas added. "And I'm the one who will make sure of it." Eliza looked at him, tears burning behind her eyes. "You were my victim. I was your beginning," he said. And that's when it hit her. The way he'd shown up exactly when she started to break. The way he knew where she'd be. The way he guided her, comforted her, even when she didn't deserve it. He hadn't been chasing closure. He'd been writing it. "You were always planning this," she said. Thomas stepped forward. "I was writing a book," he said, "about you. About the woman who stole lives and identities and never once looked back. I was going to call it The Beautiful Fraud." He looked ashamed for a moment. "But then I saw how much pain you carried, and I thought maybe you deserved a better ending. So you made one up?" He hesitated. "Not made up. Refined." The imposter walked around Eliza like a mirror circling a flame. "I'm not a con artist," she said. "I'm a correction." "A hallucination," Eliza spat. Thomas shook his head. "She's real." "No, she's not. She's just a version of me you built to make your story clean." "She's better," he said softly. Eliza stepped forward. "Then kill me," she said. Thomas blinked. "What? You want a perfect ending? Kill the mess. Kill the original. Let her replace me. Let the story have symmetry. Isn't that what writers love?" The imposter smiled wider, but Thomas didn't move, because he wasn't a killer, just a man who had finally found control, and Eliza had just ripped it from him. "Your story is broken," she said. And you don't get to fix it by creating another me. Thomas's hand trembled. The notebook slipped from his fingers. It hit the floor with a soft thump. Pages scattered, and Eliza saw it, written on the inside cover. The final version. By Thomas Granger. Inspired by a life I once thought I understood. She looked up at him. I may be a fraud, she whispered, but at least I never sold someone else's soul to clean my conscience. Thomas didn't answer. The imposter stepped back, frowning. The mirror behind her flickered, just slightly, and in the reflection, Eliza saw herself, not the imposter, her, older, bruised, breathing, still here. She reached for the broken notebook, tore the last page free, held it in her hands, then lit it with a match from the fireplace. The flames licked the ink, and with it, the ending Thomas had tried to write for her. Gone, burned, claimed. I write my own ending, she said. The imposter hissed. The mirror cracked. And just like that, she was gone. Thomas collapsed into the chair behind him. Eliza stood over him. You wanted a masterpiece, she said, but you forgot something. He looked up, pale. What? She leaned close. I'm not a story. I'm the one who survived it. She didn't kill them. Not the imposter, not Thomas, not even the story. She left the house on Castor's Hollow in the middle of the night, smoke trailing from its chimney as the last page of the stolen manuscript burned into ash. She didn't run. She didn't cry. She didn't look back. She just walked. And for the first time in her life, Eliza didn't know where she was going. She didn't have to. She had no aliases left, no forged ID, no printed name she could hide behind, no final version to sign. She had burned it all, and it hadn't set her free. It had just left her alone. She drifted from town to town like fog across the hills. Small places, cheap inns, diner breakfasts, train stations where no one asked for her name. She tried once, just once, to reintroduce herself to someone. A woman at a cafe counter in a sleepy village near the Canadian border. They'd made small talk, laughed, and then the woman asked kindly, "What's your name, dear?" Eliza opened her mouth and said, "Elizabeth," then stopped, paused. "No," she whispered, "not that." The woman tilted her head. "Sorry?" Eliza tried again. "Eliza. Wilkins." The woman smiled, puzzled. "I'm sorry. Should I know you?" "No," Eliza said softly. "No one does." That was the last time she told anyone. She began to wonder if the name even sounded real anymore. After all, what was a name but repetition? A shape you carved into other people's memory until they couldn't forget you? She had no such shape now, no repetition. She was a ghost of her own design, and worse, she had no one to haunt. Weeks passed. She stayed in a quiet coastal town by the cliffs. The people there were polite, distant. They let her rent a room with cash and didn't ask questions. She read newspapers daily, flipped through the pages, looking for herself. There were no headlines about the real Elizabeth Bigley. No exposés about forged identities, stolen inheritances, or murdered reputations. The world had accepted the imposter's death, the woman found in the river, with perfect dental records and a full confession tucked into her coat. The obituary had run once, with a small photo, a photo of her own face. Below it, "A life of fraud ends with one final truth." They never ran a correction, because no one sent one, because no one knew one was needed, not even Thomas. Eliza sometimes wondered what had become of him. Whether he had gone on to write something else, some other story with a new subject, someone simpler, cleaner, someone who wouldn't resist being finished, or maybe he'd vanished too, swallowed by guilt, by shame, or maybe by the story itself. In the end, it didn't matter. She no longer belonged to him, and the woman who wore her face, the reflection, the shadow, the beautiful fraud, was gone. Eliza had stared her down, reclaimed her truth, burned her ending, and yet the world still remembered the wrong version. She spent days sitting on the cliffs above the sea, watching the waves crash against black rock, salt stinging the air, the wind tearing at her coat. She often thought of jumping, not out of despair, but out of emptiness. What was left after you tore away every lie and found nothing underneath? What was left when the world had forgotten your face, your name, your guilt, your voice? When no one knew your story? Was a truth still a truth, if no one believed it? One morning, a child wandered up the cliff path. A girl, maybe 9 or 10, freckled, red scarf. She was chasing something, a kite that had blown loose in the wind and caught on a branch. She struggled to pull it down. Eliza watched. The string snapped. The girl sat down and cried. Without thinking, Eliza walked over, picked up the kite, untangled it, and handed it to her. The girl blinked up at her. "Thanks, miss." Eliza smiled. "You're welcome." The girl tilted her head. "What's your name?" Eliza looked out at the sea for a moment, then back at the girl. "Eliza," she said. "Just Eliza." The girl nodded and ran off, kite in hand. No recognition. No suspicion. Just a stranger who helped her when she needed it, and for the first time in her entire life, that was enough. She didn't need to be remembered. She didn't need headlines, or revenge, or legacy. The lie had died, and what was left behind was her. Quiet, unforgiving, but real. And sometimes being real was the only ending that mattered. That night, back in her small, rented room, she lit a candle. She pulled out a page of the blank paper, not to forge, not to lie, but to write. One truth, one final sentence in her own hand, in her own name. My story was stolen, rewritten, buried, burned, and forgotten. But I'm still here. My name is Eliza, and that's enough. She folded the paper, placed it on the windowsill, left the candle burning, and went to sleep. Not as Elizabeth, not as a fraud, not as a reflection, but as herself. The book found her by accident. She wasn't looking for it. She wasn't looking for anything anymore. 3 weeks had passed since she left the house in Castor's Hollow. 3 weeks of drifting along the edges of the world, unnoticed, unnamed, untouched. The quiet had become her sanctuary. Until one gray afternoon, Eliza ducked into a small bookshop to avoid the rain. It was quaint, shelves made from old doors, mismatched rugs, the scent of coffee and dry pages thick in the air. She wandered with no intention, letting her fingers brush faded spines, avoiding mirrors, avoiding questions. And then, it found her. A small stand near the front counter. 10 hardcover copies, all freshly printed, face out like a shrine. The title was simple. The Final Version by Thomas Granger. And below the title, her face, not a photo, a sketch, soft, elegant, familiar, too familiar, because it wasn't just a picture of her, it was her as Eleanor Crane, her imposter's version, beautiful, composed, hollow-eyed, the perfect lie. Eliza stared at the cover, her stomach turning. This wasn't a retelling. This was a eulogy for a woman who never existed. She picked up a copy, hands trembling, flipped through the pages. Chapter 1, The Woman in the River. Chapter 3, The Town That Never Knew Her Name. Chapter 7, A Confession Signed in Smoke. Each page bled with fiction parading as truth. The story of a con artist who found redemption, forgave her sins, and died quietly before history could judge her too harshly. A convenient version, a polished version, not hers. There were no aliases, no escape, no Nora, no reflection, no fire, no cliff, no real mother, no Eliza Wilkins, just a single chapter called The Prototype. It was short, detached, like an afterthought, describing a raw, unpolished version of the woman we came to know. Unstable, shapeless, a ghost without purpose. It didn't name her, didn't even say she was real. Just hinted, as if she were some early draft discarded in pursuit of literary perfection. Eliza slammed the book shut. Her pulse thundered in her ears. The clerk behind the counter looked up. "Good read?" he asked, smiling. She stared at him blankly, then nodded. "Sure," she said, "if you like fiction." She bought a copy, not to read it, to burn it, but not yet. She needed to know how far it had gone. That evening, she checked into a small hotel with creaking stairs and a flickering hallway light. In her room, she turned on the television. The author, Thomas Granger, was on screen. A news program, late-night interview. He looked older, sharper, polished in a tailored suit. He smiled the way only liars do, slowly, like he knew you'd believe him before you even heard what he said. "It's not a biography," he was saying. "It's a meditation on identity, redemption, the power of rewriting our past." The host nodded. "But the character, Eleanor Crane, she's based on someone real?" Thomas hesitated. "Perfectly. Inspired by real events," he said. "But like all great stories, the truth lives between the lines." The host smiled. "Well, it's powerful, emotional, and it's selling out across the country." Thomas lowered his eyes humbly. "I only told the story she never could." Eliza stared at the screen, mouth dry. The imposter was gone. The mirror was shattered, but the lie had survived her. And now it was being sold for $24.99 in hardcover. She went online, typed her own name into the search bar. Eliza Margaret Wilkins, no matches. Then Elizabeth Bigley. Hundreds of hits, all pointing to the book, to Eleanor Crane, to a woman who never lived, to a version of herself that had erased her completely. She even found an academic blog debating whether the prototype had ever existed at all. One commenter wrote, "It's clearly metaphorical. The idea of a discarded self. There's no evidence anyone named Eliza Wilkins was ever involved." Another replied, "Exactly. That's what makes the story beautiful. It shows how sometimes we have to abandon who we were to become who we need to be." Eliza sat back in the motel chair and laughed, a sharp, broken sound, not from humor, but because this was the one thing she never expected. To live through it all, only to be told she was the fake. She stayed up all night, rereading the book, cover to cover, highlighting every sentence that twisted the truth, every passage that warped her life into a script. And by dawn, the margin notes were furious scratches in red ink. Lie. I never said this. This was her, not me. I was there. You stole this. But it didn't matter. The pages were already printed. The lie was on shelves. And no one was coming to ask her side. Because as far as the world knew, Eliza Wilkins never existed. She could have burned it. The book. The man. The empire. She thought about it. She imagined walking onto a stage at one of Thomas's signings, holding up the real documents, the photographs, the letters, screaming the truth into a microphone. I am the story. But what would that make her? Another mad woman, another liar claiming to be the ghost of someone already buried in literature. They wouldn't believe her. They'd call her an obsessive fan, or worse, a fraud. She knew the irony. It stung. After a lifetime of fooling the world, now telling the truth was the least believable thing she could do. So she asked herself the question again. Is a truth worth living if no one hears it? And she thought about the girl on the cliff, the little red scarf, the smile when Eliza handed her kite back. That moment hadn't been part of anyone's story. It hadn't been published, or sold, or stolen. It was hers, small, quiet, unwritten, but real. That morning, she packed her bag. She took the burned birth certificate, the last journal page she wrote, and the book, one copy, and she mailed it to someone. Not the press, not a publisher, not even a lawyer. She mailed it to Nora, the girl who bore her name through blood and accident, her daughter. She left a note tucked into the pages. Let them have their ending, but no, you come from the truth. You come from the version that never got published, but still survived. Eliza. Then she boarded a train. Window seat. No destination. No alias. No mirror. Just her. Just silence. And for once in her life, it felt like freedom. The train curved along the coast like a silver ribbon stitched into earth. Sea to one side, forest to the other. Trees flicked past the windows in silent rhythm, 1,000 green blurs whispering the same message. Let it go. Let it go. Let it go. Eliza sat in the second car, middle seat, no bag except a notebook. No aliases, no names, not even Elizabeth. She didn't need it anymore. Not for the conductor, not for the woman beside her knitting quietly, not for the boy who stared at her curiously, as if trying to place her face from a television screen he couldn't quite remember. She didn't belong to anyone anymore, and that was freedom in its cruelest, purest form. The world knew her as dead, as Eleanor Crane, the redeemed con woman, the forgiven fraud, the woman who washed her sins in a river and left behind a diary of remorse so poetic, so clean, that even the obituary sounded like scripture. That woman, the imposter, had become immortal. Her story was being adapted into film. Thomas Granger was on another book tour. There were book clubs and university essays debating Eleanor's emotional arc. One professor called her a symbol of feminine complexity. Another called her a rare case of criminal grace. And in all of it, Eliza was gone, buried not in water, but in words. But she wasn't angry anymore. That emotion had burned out weeks ago when she watched the first interview and realized it didn't matter who the world believed, because she was never trying to be believed. She had spent years running from herself, dressing up in new lives, thinking that if she could just disappear into someone else, the past would stop chasing her. But it didn't. It followed her, it wrote her, it rewrote her. Until one day, she realized, the truth doesn't survive in the mouth of the crowd. It survives in the person who keeps whispering it, long after the crowd stops listening. And she was still whispering. In a town called Gale Haven, the train stopped for 30 minutes. Eliza stepped off, stretched her legs, and walked into a second-hand store across from the station. She found a manual typewriter, dusty, rusted at the edges, one key sticking slightly. She bought it for $8, taped a piece of paper to it, wrote one line. "This is not the version you've heard. This is the one that bled." She rented a room above a bakery, told the landlord her name was just E. He didn't ask further. Every morning, she wrote, not for publishers, not for readers, not even for Nora, just for herself. Her fingers fumbled over the keys at first, unfamiliar with the sound of truth, but the more she pressed, the easier it came. This wasn't a confession. She had already confessed. This wasn't a memoir. She had already been reduced to one. This was a rescue. Of every moment that had been twisted, every sentence that had been stolen, every version of her that had been flattened for mass consumption. She wrote it all. The scams, the childhood, the con jobs, the aliases, the breakdown, the woman in the mirror, Thomas, Nora, even her mother, but not as stories to entertain, as wounds to close. Each paragraph was a stitch, each chapter a scar healing into skin. She didn't stop for months. When she ran out of paper, she borrowed old journals and typed on the backs of receipts. When the typewriter broke, she wrote by hand. She stopped reading the news, stopped chasing what people thought of her, stopped imagining confrontation. She had already lived it. Now she was doing what they all feared she would, living without their permission. One evening, someone knocked on her door. A girl stood there, tall, wide-eyed, red scarf around her neck, Nora. Eliza's heart caught. They hadn't spoken since the letter. She opened the door fully. Nora held up a paperback. The final version. She held it with 2 fingers like it disgusted her. "I read it," she said. Eliza stepped back to let her in. Nora walked straight to the table where the typewriter sat, surrounded by loose pages. "You're writing," she said. "Something real," Eliza answered. Nora picked up a page, read, sat down, and cried. They didn't talk for a long time. Just the sound of the sea outside. Finally, Eliza said, "You look like him." Nora laughed through her tears. "I don't even know his name." Eliza smiled. "Neither did I." Silence again. Then Nora whispered, "Why didn't you tell your side?" Eliza looked out the window. "I did," she said. "You're holding it." Nora stayed the night. In the morning, she left with a box of pages. No promises, no publishing contracts, just truth, unedited, unfiltered, unfinished, but honest. Months passed, then a year, then another. The world moved on from Eleanor Crane. Thomas Granger released another book. It flopped. People forgot. But somewhere, in a quiet corner of the world, a small independent press released a limited print of a strange, fragmented manuscript titled "The One Who Wasn't Buried" by E. Wilkins. No fanfare, no interviews, no explanation. But the readers who found it, they knew. They could feel it in the voice. This wasn't the pretty version. This wasn't the woman who died politely in a river. This was the woman who survived being stolen and lived without applause. Years later, Nora would stand at a lectern in a small college classroom, reading the opening passage to a group of curious students. She'd say, "My mother wasn't famous, not really. The woman in the book you've heard of, Eleanor Crane, that wasn't her. My mother's name was Eliza, and she survived more than the world ever gave her credit for. This is the truth they never published, but I'm here to speak it anyway." As for Eliza, she lived by the sea. Old, quiet, alone by choice. She didn't chase mirrors anymore. She didn't fear her reflection, because now, when she looked in glass, she saw a face she recognized, lined, worn, but real. No headlines followed her into death. No best-selling memoir. No true crime podcast. Just a single line carved into a plain stone by the sea. Eliza Margaret Wilkins. She told the truth when no one was listening. At the end of she built her empire on lies and lost her mind to guilt.